Good day. So this presentation will be about critical discourse analysis in the social sciences. So as a transition presentation from the theories that we have discussed so far and the example of underdevelopment and dependency theory that I have given to the class, I would like to introduce this method and theory called critical discourse analysis. So this is a method that is not usually used in the social sciences. You may have met this already in your Soksay 199 or your other subjects. But I would like to contextualize this theory and method further in the study of postcolonialism, as it is the main focus of our Social Science 198. This could also be a method that you can use in your papers. So nonetheless, if you have met this already, so this could be an addition to what you know already. And I am also sharing this because I learned a lot while studying this, and the method I observed is also useful when we are talking about how to study postcolonialism in the social sciences. So there could be other methods, so this is just one of them. So these are the topics that we will cover for this presentation. So first is, of course, the relationship or the application of critical discourse analysis in our study of postcolonialism, some aims of CDA researches, the analysis of the use of language and how is it used and how is it important for discourse analysis and critical discourse analysis. We will also define in length and in detail discourse, the idea of discourse, and of course language, because this method is using language, studying language in order to see power relations, to expose power relations. So that's why it's very important for post-colonialism. Discourse analysis in the literature is considered to be a method, a methodology, and a theory. When we say method, it could be a means to do research. As you have learned from your core courses, methodology means the whole package of a research design that you consider, not just the way that you will consider not just the way you will do your research or the method, but also the epistemological and ontological underpinnings of the process of the research as well as the subject of your study. Discourse analysis as a theory, or at least follows a theory of how knowledge can be culled from sources or data, and what is the nature of or kind of data that can be used for a study. Generally, discourse analysis is a theory on text production and text reception. On text production, we also already had experience on this when we discussed Said. When we say texts, this could be anything that can be read, not just documents, but also events, actions, utterances. Analysis is on the level of how these texts are produced. Like in Said, the analysis was on literature produced by the West and how these reflect a monolithic image of the West. So that's a study on text production, which is also a way of knowledge production. Text reception is also another thing to analyze. How is this text seen by readers if we are talking about text as documents? Or how is an action, which is also a text, how is an action interpreted? Again, we have already met this in Spivak, when the suicide of a woman was interpreted as widow sacrifice when the woman clearly committed it for another reason. So we saw two sides, the view of the scholar and the view of the woman who produced the text. So their views were different. So therefore, there could be difference in the interpretation of a text on how it is received or how is it interpreted by people who receive or people who read the texts outside of the context of that text. So discourse analysis is very useful in highlighting the reasons for these differences. So it's a method, a methodology, and a theory. So therefore, when you do a discourse analysis, you could, it's a whole theoretical framework. As I mentioned in the course, especially in Said and Spivak, deconstruction of texts is one way to study postcolonialism. Deconstruction, of course, is a very complex process that I will not explain in detail here, but simply it can be defined or described as reading against the grain. So if we will relate deconstruction to discourse analysis, if we are to look at an article or a book published, for example, as Edward Said did, we do not just read that piece of literature. We discuss the discourses inside it. We look at how this piece of work is related to other contemporary works. We look at this work and find if it has biases. And we also look at the author's background. If it is an action, for example, a protest, which is also a text, we read the protest, not just a reaction to recent events. Like, for example, when we look at student protests protesting the a higher tuition, we do not just see it as a reaction to higher tuition, but we could also read it as a part of a movement because um, of a movement to fight for free education, for example, in other universities, or more quality education that is already a concern of students since years before a certain protest. So um, maybe also the protesters have are coming from different backgrounds and they have certain specific views or similar views on a certain issues. We can also see where they get their information. Is the information correct? So as a text, the protest is not just seen as a protest in itself, but we also discuss the context, the rationale of people, why they are there. So this is one process of deconstructing the text, reading against the grain. You can find something that isn't there superficially. Okay. For example, if you can find that the grievances in that protest is not just related to the plight of students who cannot pay the tuition or the tuition that the tuition, right? But we can look at if they connect this to national issues. So it's not necessarily superficially there that the protest is about that. But in reading against the grain, we can look at other meanings, other interpretations. So these interpretations are the ones that we are looking for when we do discourse analysis and deconstruction of texts. So texts are, as mentioned in the previous slides, are the main object of study in a discourse analysis. An addition to the earlier discussion is that in discourse analysis, we could look for present or absent element in a text. So, sabi ko nga kanina, texts could be written works and concrete oral utterances and written documents. But they could also be actions, as in Spivak, because Spivak is very much involved, or she is also doing deconstruction when she was looking at the case of the widow sacrifice and the suicide of that woman. Okay, so it could also be actions, could be words, could be conversation. So these are all texts when we say texts. Okay, so in discourse analysis, we could look at the presence or absence of some elements in texts. So for example, if we want to analyze a government document, we want to find whether it is, for example, gender sensitive, if it uses words that are gender sensitive. Because of course, before this discourse on gender sensitivity, government documents or even scholarly works refer to people as men, right? And of course, that's not gender sensitive. So if you want to assess that in a specific government document, we look for the presence or absence of those words that are gender sensitive in the text, because we consider, for example, this discourse of gender as a social construct, as also a discourse that we can find in a text. So for example, for a government document, does it use man to refer to all humans or people, thereby discriminating other against women or other genders. So that's one way of how we can study texts, or on how we can study texts. So for these courses, oh, I know that I have been mentioning these courses since the beginning of the class, and I also have a small discussion of it in the Orientalism video. So discourse analysis is very specific and very comprehensive about the definition of discourse, the idea of discourse that it seeks to analyze. So let's look at the several definitions and descriptions of discourse. So the first, and I think the most important idea of discourse that I have also mentioned in the Orientalism video, is the Foucauldian idea of discourse. So the Foucauldian idea of discourse is that they are practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. So this idea of discourse is what Edward Said employed or used in his work Orientalism. Orientalism is a discourse that is powerful in a sense that it is a practice, at least in writing literature, that creates the image of the other. In this case, they speak for the other and also create the other as they speak. In Fanon, we also see this discourse at work when he looked at himself as a black man and looked at his other, the whites, and knowing that whites already had an image of him. They carry or reinforce the discourse of blackness that he himself as a person has yet to discover. He is now being faced with this image of a black man that are full of stereotypes and racial prejudice. So this is the major definition of discourse that we use, at least in the social sciences, when we do if we do discourse analysis. The way discourses can be productive or creative in the sense that they create the image of the objects of which they speak. So I remember Foucault discussing this in the context of certain disciplines, wherein when you have a discipline, the very idea of discipline, right? Pag sinabing disiplina, it's something that is that you are trying to categorize everything. For example, we have the disciplines in the social sciences that we can identify which is if something could be studied in history, or could be studied in anthropology or psychology, that you actually create spaces wherein you study these things, like for example the human mind, or uh, the humanity in general, the society. In what discipline could you study it? So when you do that, you're actually creating, for example, you're creating the image, or you're creating this assumption that this thing could only be studied in this discipline. And when you discipline, no, that's why we have disciplines. We are taught jargons, we are taught words that only we in the social sciences or in our specific or respective disciplines could understand, and it creates this sort of space of power wherein tayo lang, only us could speak of these things. Okay. And you also know the issues of disciplines creating the objects. So we have discussed this extensively in class on how anthropology, for example, as a discipline, have historically studied cultures, indigenous peoples, and how this has an effect on the image of these peoples that they study. So not just anthropology, but also history with its fascination of great men, right? Also created a discipline where you could just study the past through great men. So now there are alternatives to this, but these were previous mainstream discourses that are related to these practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. As disciplines, we are complicit to this practice, especially as undergrad. No? So we are being trained in our discipline, to know the major thinkers of our discipline, to know the major methods that we use in the discipline, thereby reinforcing the jargons, the words, the subjects of study that has been who have been historically the subjects of study in our disciplines. So it creates and reinforces the image of, for example, of what an anthropologist is, what a historian is. Of course, again, there are many alternatives right now, but our examples in the class of Said and Fanon, and yun nga, the example of Foucault would be great examples of the idea of discourse. So, however, aside from that, we can discuss discourse in other ways. So that may be the science definition of it. But in the humanities, where discourse analysis is more often used as a method, discourse may also refer to actual language or manner of speech used in a text. It could also refer to how people use terms specific to a certain discipline. So you have their discourse as the highest unit of linguistic description, the phrases, clauses, sentences, and texts. So when you say texts in this definition, it's simply what is written and what is spoken. Okay, so discourse could be a sample of language usage or speech. So in terms of discipline, it is communication expected in one situation context, like the discourse of law or medicine. So that's another aspect or definition of discourse. Another distinction that we can find in the literature about discourse is the difference with discourse with a lowercase d and discourse with an uppercase d. But this is not actually strict, but you can see the difference. Like the lowercase d discourse is referring to actual language, like talk and text, talking or speech, and text, written text. While the uppercase D discourse would refer to discourse pertaining to a particular area or discipline, or the systems of thought, assumption, and talk patterns that dominate a particular area. So we have already seen this in the last slide in the example about discourse of medicine or discourse of law. So they have their own jargons, they have their own way of writing things, they have their own way of talking. So that could be considered the uppercase D discourse. So to add to that, discourse is also defined as the process of communicating and speaking, and not the actual language itself, meaning discourse, meaning the process of talking, right? So it stands for the whole communicative event. So when discourse analysis is used in the humanities, usually these communicative events, whether personal or written, are the discourses that are analyzed. So again, it's the actual process, the actual human interaction, or the spoken interaction. So it could also refer to verbal or non-verbal interaction. So that's one discourse that is studied, especially in the humanities. So this is where they use textual and discourse analysis when they study speeches or study conversations, like transcripts of conversations or actual conversations, or the way people talk to each other. So far in the previous slides, we can summarize these definitions and descriptions of discourses into these three. So first, as the German and Central European tradition in the humanities as part of text linguistics, which is discourse, as the process or the communicative event. Discourse in the Anglo-American tradition would be written and oral texts. And the discourse in the social sciences and the discourse that we also met when we discussed Said is Foucauldian, as an abstract form of knowledge, cognition, and emotion. And the idea that it's creative or productive, that it produces the very object that it speaks for, or that it represents. So these definitions of discourse can also be understood through these Filipino words. talastasan. So sa pag-aaral natin sa universidad, halimbawa, madalas ito ang ginagawa natin, talastasan. Ang pakikipagtalastasan sa pamamagitan ng pakikipag-usap sa isa't isa o kaya naman ay sa pagsusulat. Kaya kung titingnan naman natin yung mga kaugnay na salita o yung salitang ugat ng talastasan, katulad ng talastas, mas mauunawaan natin kung bakit ito kaugnay ng salitang discourse na kadalasan ay sinasabi nating diskurso sa Filipino. Sa pakikipagtalastasan ay hinahasa o pinapatalas natin ang ating kaisipan o kaalaman. So, yung talas. Ang pakikipagtalastasan ay isa ring proseso, the process, again, the communicative event. And ang pakikipagtalastasan ay isang proseso ng pagtatalastas. So, ano ba yung pagtatalastas? Presentation ng mga ideya. So, sa simpleng salita, ang pakikipagtalastasan ay maaari ding maunawaan bilang pag-uusap, like actual conversation, as I've mentioned in the previous slides. Sa discourse analysis, tinitingnan ng proseso ng pag-uusap na ito at ang mga paraan para italastas o i-present ang mga ideya o impormasyon sa pamamagitan ng pagsusulat o harapang pakikipag-usap. Yung tastas naman, ito ay pinapaliwanag nito yung proseso ng pagtatastas. Tinatastas ang proseso ng pakikipag-usap, pakikipagtalastasan, kaparehas ng proseso ng deconstruction para mapalalim ang pag-unawa sa mga ideya o sa mga paraan na pakikipag-usap at pagsasalita. Mapapansin na ang mga salitang ito ay kaugnay din ng mga napag-usapan natin sa mga nakaraang slide, na ang discourse ay maaring binibigkas sa pakikipag-usap o sinusulat, o di kaya naman ay discourse na isang forma ng kaalaman, gaya ng teorya ni Foucault. So itong mga kaugnayan sa pagitan ng talastasan at saka yung mga salitang ugat niya or yung mga related kaugnay na salita katulad ng talastas, talas, tastas, ay binibigyan tayo ng isa pang perspective na kung paano natin mauunawaan yung discourse in Filipino. Hindi siya simpleng diskurso na pakikipagtalastasan. May proseso at saka yung yung mismong proseso ng presentation of ideas, of conversation. Now, these are the things that we study in discourse analysis. So, as I've mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, we will look at language because language and the study of language use is central to discourse analysis. So, what about language that we want to study? We want to look at how language facilitates the construction of social identities and social realities and how meaning can be discerned through the use of language. So, I'm sure that if you have already finished Soksai 197, that you have a more concrete grasp of the idea of language as a part of being human and also as a part of our study of the society, because it is the vessel through which we could learn about our culture. It is where we reinforce certain social norms, and yun nga, this is also how we negotiate our identities through language, through speaking. So it's not it's complicated like that, but it's all the more complicated when we see that language could also be used to reinforce inequality, to reinforce identities that are not congruent with our national identity, for example, or the identity that we want for ourselves, and that through language we can discern more meaning that is in the actual text. So Said also used this method in his study of Orientalism, as he looked for utterances that reinforce the Orientalist discourse. Fanon in his work, though we cannot say that his work is a discourse analysis, because that would be a disservice to his work. It's not a discourse analysis, but it's a parallel, because you could see that he also looked at words and the words that are being thrown to him as a black person. And he concluded that these words are kind of similar. Whoever uttered the word, it's similar, and everyone shares the same word for the derogatory terms that are used against them. And how this is how language in itself could be something that yun nga, it has meaning, and for them its meaning is very very negative. Okay, so meaning can also be discerned through words used as in Fanon. For example, in Homi Baba's notion of mimicry, he notes how the colonized can copy the language of the colonizer, make it their own, and even use it for parody or resistance. Thus, when we see, for example, Del Pilar's Dasalan and Tuksohan, I put this in the VLE if you're interested. He parodied Catholic prayers. So we do not just see these string of words as a parody of Spanish or Catholic prayers. It's not just simply that. They are forms of resistance. They represent experiences of oppression of Filipinos during that time. It has meaning, and this meaning we could discern through language use. Language use also could also refer to the choice of words, because sometimes there are more neutral words that may seem neutral but they are not. Or sometimes in texts there are deliberate choices of words that also deliberately mean something. So we'll see that later. So the title of this presentation is Critical Discourse Analysis. So we have discussed discourse analysis so far. So what makes CDA, or critical discourse analysis, critical? Discourse, as in Foucault and according to Jones 2012, is always ideological and it always has an agenda. Again, as in Said, through language, we can see certain versions of reality and kinds of relationships that are being portrayed. When we say versions of reality or portrayal, it means that in texts, there could be an image that is formed that is different from reality. As in, again, Edward Said, when he said that the image of the East that is in Western literature, and as you also answered in your discussion forum about Orientalist films, books, that these representations of Asians or non-Westerners are not actually consistent with what is happening in reality. So we can see this through language, the language used to refer to Asians, for example. What are the words attached, or what are the stereotypes? So again, this is an analysis of language. Come to think of it, we can also see how discourses, through the reading of texts, draw upon and reinforce larger systems of belief. Again, you did this when you did the the discussion forum, when you looked at the discourses in these films and other literary works that you have mentioned. And some of you even discussed the behind the scenes, the writing of the books, the casting of films as something that is very important, because they reinforce certain images and certain larger systems of belief that may or may not be good for the people involved. So come to think of it, the conversations on the elections that we can find in social media are also discourses. In critically looking at these, we cannot just generalize that they are conversations between and among trolls. Amongst people conversing, we can see how each of them carry information or even ideology that guides their beliefs and convictions about certain candidates. So again, that requires going beyond the text. It requires going beyond the conversation that you see in social media, for example. You need to look at the background, for example, of these people, or the source of information, where they got the information from, okay, and other things, so that we could critically analyze. So one aim of critical discourse analysis is to raise awareness concerning the strategies used in establishing, maintaining, and reproducing asymmetrical relations of power as enacted by means of discourse. This will be the reason why CDA, or critical discourse analysis, is fit for studies on postcolonialism or in studying postcolonial societies. It shares the same ideal, that is, to surface otherwise hidden or taken for granted discourses that are in texts. In surfacing these discourses, there may also be an emancipatory goal, that is, to inform people of these inequalities that are also present in the discursive realm, and also study how this is manifest in real-world settings. For example, using my example again of the government documents being gender sensitive. So if we see that they are not gender sensitive, this could be a reflection of how they implement policies that could be discriminatory to other genders without them knowing or unconsciously, right? So in Baguio City, I have this observation that when you see press releases, they refer to the city heads or the city executives. So, of course, the mayor is Magalong. But he is a man. No, but um, I'm sure that there are also women in the in their offices, of course. No, so, but they are called dads. Okay, so in press releases in the city, they're always called dads. Okay, so what does this mean? That the city is a family, or that there is muting of female voices who are also in the city council? So I have yet to confirm if they're all men there, but still, the use of dads in formal press releases is not just informal, but also carries with it certain discourses. So it reinforces patriarchal discourses that, again, could reflect in real-world policy. So in post-colonial texts, as was done by the scholars we have uh, done so far, we could also see this. Some key terms that are some of the subjects of study in CDA are the following: ideology, power, dominance, prejudice, and representation. So I won't discuss them one by one because these are terms that should be familiar to us, as these were already discussed by the previous thinkers that we have discussed so far in the course. So you will notice that yun nga, in critical discourse analysis, these are the things that we will be looking for, that we could look for, na how certain texts could reinforce certain power relations, certain prejudices or representations that are carrying certain discourses na maybe orientalist, imperialist, or whatnot. So to reiterate the text itself, such as passages, phrases, words, names, choice of words, or other yun nga, actual conversations, written and spoken speech, spoken language, are units of analysis for CDA study. So, however, in critical discourse analysis, we are not just looking at one text, but we relate it also to other texts. Intertextuality is a concept that is usually discussed in deconstruction. In analyzing a text, we consider its context and its relationship to other texts. So that's intertextuality. So we look at not just a primary source, one source, but also secondary sources that would either refute or support the major or the main source. So in my example previously about the city of Baguio referring to its heads as dads, it is rash to generalize that it will be affecting city policies. To prove this, we need to look at texts other than articles. So of course, I saw that in articles that are formally uh, written and released by the city of Baguio. So we need to look at other articles. So, and also about city policies, no, we look at that, or city development plans. So if this is consistent and the efforts of other members of the council are continuously being lumped under the policies of the city dads, then that would indeed be a problem. So it's one text and we refer to other texts. So kind of a triangulation, but also a process of contextualization. So in post-colonialism, we discuss texts as they are also related to other texts. Colonizers have created the image of the other, and we have evidence regarding this as these discourses are apparent in government documents, government policies, and even oral and written histories. So for this part, we look at some examples of critical discourse analysis researches that you can find in the literature. Of course, there are more, so these are just examples. So one article that I found is this, Discourse Analysis of Elite American Newspaper Editorials, the Case of Iran's Nuclear Program. So there are two research questions for this article. How are events, players, and policies about the Iranian nuclear program portrayed in these three U.S. elite newspapers? I forgot to note the U.S. elite newspapers, but I think this is Washington Post, New York Times, and another one. No, and the authors looked at um, how the Iranian nuclear program are being reported in these newspapers. And then another research question is, are Orientalist arguments used as premises for advancing policy recommendations? So you may think that in a media outlet, very uh, an elite newspaper outlet would be very objective in its reporting of, for example, of this case of the Iranian nuclear program. So if you're not familiar to this, on this, then maybe you could also think of Iraq's the war, American involvement in Iraq or Afghanistan. It will be the same thing. They have kind of a similar conclusion that the portrayal of peoples in these areas are always very orientalized in newspapers. So you could expect newspapers. So at this time, 2007, wala pang social media niyan. Hindi pa masyadong, it's not it's not an issue yet. It's not an issue yet, but it has been a reality for decades now that newspaper outlets and media outlets in general, the newspapers, TV programs, TV and news programs are heavily biased. Okay, and they have in the United States, for example, they have leanings that are either Republican or Democrat. Right? So they looked at that through these American newspapers. So they found that and so there's a quote in the next slide. And so this is from the New York Times. Stop us if you've heard this one before. The Bush administration creates a false sense of urgency about a nuclear menace from a Middle Eastern country. Hardliners talk about that country's connections to terrorists. They portray European diplomatic efforts to diffuse tensions as a feckless attempt to appease a rogue nation whose word can never be trusted anyway. Secretary of State Colin Powell makes ominous-sounding warnings about new intelligence, which turns out to be dubious. So what you see here is that they don't believe that Iran has nuclear weapons. Okay, and why don't they believe so? Because they believe that they are not trustworthy. And that is one, if you look at Said, that is one category of which Westerners usually look at or see Asians or see, for example, the Middle East. Okay, another category would be Islam as a threat. So this whole discourse can be contextualized in this category or in this orientalized image of the East as Islamic, and Islamic is always equal to terrorism. Okay, so in the discourses in the newspapers that they have discussed or they have analyzed through critical discourse analysis, they saw that the newspapers are very biased, and they're saying that the government is not, yun nga, sabi dyan, they create a false sense of urgency because you cannot trust them anyway. They don't want to believe that Iran has a nuclear program, and they also believe that they do not have the capability to have such program. Okay, and that shows you how they view non-Westerners. So, Izade and Sagharia in 2007 concluded that these newspapers are indeed very biased and reproduce or reinforce Orientalized notions of the East. So, that's just one example. So, they also provided more examples. So here you can also see how language use is being analyzed as they put quotes, many quotes in their paper. They also did a textual analysis, a purely textual analysis wherein they find the certain words that are referred that they used to refer to Iran and its nuclear program, such as, like, for example, they found many words that are related to terrorism, rogue nation, trustworthiness, etc. So, these they analyzed this, of course, in with other texts and concluded that they are indeed very orientalized. Okay, and the newspapers who are supposed to be objective are not objective, and that there's a tendency to sway public opinion regarding this. And of course, as you know, this is in the newspapers in the 2000s. Now, this is more amplified by social media, because um, it's not just the fact that you have so much information, but so much information that are not fact checked all the time, that affects people's opinion and also actions. So in my undergrad thesis, um, I also discussed or used discourse analysis. So some of my questions were this. So how was knowledge production about the Philippines as an American colony portrayed in the following colonial historiographies, given the socio-political, temporal, and spatial milieu of the author? So the title of my research was Finding the Lost Filipina, a discourse analysis of Philippine histories, 1900s to 1940s. So I looked at historiographies or written histories in the 1900s to the 1940s that were mostly are written by Americans and Europeans on the Philippines. What was absurd was that um, Americans and Europeans wrote about the Philippines without going to the Philippines because the archives are in Europe. But it's still absurd that they write about something that they have not seen yet. So you can see there how they reproduce certain orientalized image. So I was concerned on finding the Filipina, okay, the woman in these texts. So, as I've said, intertextuality is important. So, I did not just look at the historiographies or the written histories, but I also did digging of the lives of the people who wrote the histories that I have discussed. Now, so did they come to the Philippines? What are their main occupation? Are they really historians? Yan. Then another question is, how was the orientalization of the Filipina portrayed in these colonial texts on Philippine history through the language use of the authors? So there I also did a word search of woman, of Filipina, and other orientalized words that are related to their view or their description of Filipinas. And lastly, how has the representation of the Filipina in colonial historiographies formed part and parcel of the reconstruction of an Orientalist Philippine past? So my conclusion for the study was that the image of the Filipina is matching, or it substantiated the discourse of the Americans, or supported or contributed to that discourse, that Filipinas should be governed, should be changed through imperialism or through colonialism. And it's the same image or the same thing if you're talking about the Filipino people. So if the Filipino people are misrepresented, then all the more that the Filipina is misrepresented, because it's not just imperialist or colonialist uh, values that are being imposed upon them, but also very patriarchal values, Western patriarchal values that are imposed upon them. And when you look at at Philippine history written by other people, other foreigners on the Filipinas, they do not grasp the depth of the role of the Filipinas in our history, especially if you relate it to the history of Filipina, their role in the Sinaunang Bayan, for example, because those are things that are not discussed in history written by other people. So I employed here Orientalism and of course, in discourse analysis, looking at language. So I read uh, these books, especially chapters that are related to Filipinas, such as, for example, agriculture, clothing. There are chapters like that in Philippine textbook because these historiographies serve as textbooks. Okay, so I did not just read the books as is, but I also found out what the purpose of the books were. So the purpose of the books is really to drive home the point that the Philippines is something that should be colonized. And it also represents the Orientalist um, objective to know the Orient, no, so that you could govern it. So those are the things that I found in this study. And this study is the inspiration on why this course was also formulated. So I also taught this course in 2017. Yan. So this is how I applied this discourse analysis, and I found that you could also apply this to other disciplines as well. So another article is this, representing Rosalina and Annabelle, Filipino women, violence, media representations, and contested reality. So this article discusses Filipinas in Australia as mail order brides and how they are represented on print media. So they saw the stereotypes of Australians on Filipinos because the stereotypes of Filipino abroad, right? Like usually they're just the stereotypes na laging domestic helpers lang daw sila. Yan. In this case, they are just mail order brides. So in their representations in print media, there are reports of crime of Filipinas in Australia. But what they saw, like the American newspaper one, is that there are presence of sexist, racist, and class-based discourse in their representation. Because, of course, they are foreigners who married Australians. And even though there's a fact of domestic violence from their Australian husbands, these are not reported as much in the print media that Saroca 2014 discussed. So what discourse did she find, is this discourse on violence and othering. So this constitutes a sexual and racial othering in which class is central. Sensationalist images of gender, race, and class provide little insight into the violence suffered at the hands of abusive male partners. So, you have reports of Filipinos being mail order brides in Australia, which is seen as a kind of spectacle or a kind of unusual event, of course. But they see this as a trend, but they do not see it masks the trend of also violence of Australian male partners of these women. Kasi ang nangingibabaw is that they are Filipinos. Okay? They are poor Filipinos. So, according to Saroca, this is a sexual and racial othering. So finally, you have Orientalization and Gender by Hassan 2005, where she notes how even feminists perpetuate Orientalist notions. Western Orientalist discourse was further driven by the slant of the Christian West and the Islamic East, which provided an added fantasy in the Orientalist mind, the othering of the Muslims. So, she discusses here how feminism in the West, which is they call it the first world feminism, is different from third world feminism, especially those areas where there are Muslims. So remember, I think I made it a suggested reading on Spivak on the veil, okay, the ambivalence of the veil, wherein the veil, which is uh which is the hijab, okay, but you have other kinds of hijab or other kinds of veils, no. The veil is something that is a representation of how the West wants to control the East in the guise of modernization and globalization, that they want these women to be free. So lagi kang makakakita ng comparison pictures, for example, of women in Afghanistan before and after the Taliban, no, that women are more free, then they can wear short skirts, ganyan. But in these stories and in these comparisons, we cannot what we see is just that before the Taliban, for example, they are more influenced by Americans, okay, that they are more free. So it paints a picture that the whites or the Americans are good to women, okay. And then you also having a white uh, or first world feminists whose issues are very far off from the issues of women in the third world. And they note that these first world feminists always see the hijab and the other veils as a means of oppression on women, without actually asking women if the hijab is actually oppressing them or is actually very oppressive to them. So that's why, according to Hassan, we can see differences in experience. No, of course, women are still very much discriminated, oppressed, and we have still a long way to go to achieve, the full equality. Now that also we should also consider other genders. But the idea that this complicates it when you are a third world poor indigenous woman, mas the oppression, the discrimination amplifies, and this is not considered in mainstream, or this is not considered usually in yun nga yun sa tinatawag na first world feminism. So these you can see in for example in articles by first world feminists noting how oppressive certain practices and norms are for women in the third world, without actually asking or without actually privileging the voice of third world women. Yeah, so there could also be orientalism in gender. So that's critical discourse analysis, and those are the examples of studies that employ critical discourse analysis. So CDA, again, is just one of the methodologies used in the social sciences to study post-colonialism. So in your discipline, you may have other methods that are also used. I'm looking forward to reading those in your papers. So I hope this gives you an idea of what you want to write. Yeah, so thank you very much for listening.